Eva, I'll start with you. Given the realities and complexities of the Common Core and other new standards, next generation science standards and so on, what are the key issues that schools and districts need to be thinking about and dealing with as they try to implement those standards in schools?
First of all, thank you for the introductions. I'll speak for all of us, but I think we're all very honored and excited to be here because this is something that touches the research and practice activities of all of us throughout, long and interesting careers. I first want to start off by affiliating with Tony to tell you that I was an English major too, wrote poetry, none was published. But at any rate, I still have some time left, and I might be back to that soon. The question of the realities and complexities of the Common Core and standards and the assessments connected to them, that is the whole system. The complexities of the Common Core really do depend upon your perception of what teaching and learning is about. It's not so much the newness or the cognition that's being asked for or the switches here and there, some quite significant in the content, but it's about what you think good instruction is. And my sense of formative assessment is that it is the core of what good instruction is about. Finding out where kids are in a very specific way, being able to act on that, and then being able to manage that in an environment where you may be dealing with 30 kids or 160 kids, depending upon the grade levels that you're teaching. So I think that there are implications, obviously, for comfort levels for teachers with the content and cognitive demands that may be less familiar. I think the real difficulty, as I try to think of it as if I were teaching in a classroom, like many of you, would be how could I adapt the work to the individual student's needs, which is sort of the underscore of formative assessment. And strategy, to respond to Dave's question, is one of collaboration. And I think that's collaboration among teachers, because I don't think it's possible for any one teacher to create enough adaptive options that could be used in a classroom on a regular basis to meet the kinds of needs you're going to have. So I would say that it's putting collaboration in the center of this with the concept of good teaching and individualized or adaptive learning. And I'll stop with my colleagues' comment.
Okay, Tony Petrosky.
So I have 3 things to say, and this will be a great test of whether I can say them without going off the rails. The first is, imagine a 3-legged stool. It's my favorite metaphor these days. One leg of that stool is curriculum. The other leg is assessment, performance, and formative assessments. And the third leg is professional development. We have for decades thought about those separately. Now with the Common Core standards and the call for very radical changes in teaching, students' performance, and teachers' performance, we need to always be thinking about those 3 together: curriculum, assessment, and professional development. And I'll tell you, if you're not worried about all 3 of those, you'll fail. There's no question about it. The second point I want to make is that now more than ever, but it has always been important, coherence has to be our watchword. Districts and we've worked in many at the Institute for Learning, tend towards entropy and incoherence because all the departments in all of the levels of the organization tend to become siloed. So it's very easy to have 200 people pulling 2 different ropes in 200 different directions. And now, with the Common Core, we need to all be pulling in the same direction. Perhaps the best way to do this, as Eva has suggested for teachers, is collaboration and partnerships. Can't do it alone. Now, we need partnerships of districts and schools amongst themselves, with outsiders, and partnerships of teachers working with teachers. At the Institute, where we develop a lot of curriculum in mathematics and in English, we've learned we can't do it alone. We have teams that do that work. The third point that I want to make is we used to believe in systemic change. I've never seen it happen anywhere. I think it's much more sensible, and Eva and I have talked about this just a few weeks ago with the members of this panel. Think about small bites. Think about doing coherent work in those 3 areas: curriculum, assessment, and professional development. That's manageable, that will produce success that you can then duplicate elsewhere in the district. I like vertical work, grades 6 and 7, or grades 6 and 8, and everyone who touches students in some way is involved in that work. Teachers, supervisors, principals, and district leadership. I guess that's my 3 points.
I still want to go off the rails and say more. Ray, there you go.
Okay, Pecheone.
All right, so I'll admit that I don't write poetry. I actually barely do prose, but I certainly will aspire to it, Tony. I want to drill down on sort of a central theme that both Eva and Tony have already raised. In the work we're doing, not only in systemic change, we always try to think about systemic change with one-size-fits-all models. You know, standardized curriculums, standardized instructional approaches that hopefully will impact not only specific grade levels, but impact all the grade levels in a similar way. It's a premise that when you really examine it, and Tony's already exposed it, just doesn't work. So what we're thinking about in this panel, I'm going to raise 2 issues around this. One is local context as well as teacher engagement in this process really matters. It's not like we're doing something completely new. What we need to think more strategically about is building on the kinds of rich assignments the teachers do day to day, week to week, in their classrooms. There is a base of, the Common Core isn't something new. In many ways, the higher order skills that we all aspire to as part of the Common Core may have been pushed aside or marginalized as part of an accountability system that has gone wild. And hopefully, we now are getting our senses back and saying, look, if we're going to have a meaningful assessment, we have to pay attention to local context. We have to authentically engage teachers in the design and development of this work. An example of that is one of our sponsors here is CORE. The teachers have to be intricately involved in the work. Now, it's not only them, it's also there are professionals who've done work around this area that they could draw on and adapt that work and build on. So it's not that it all has to be designed and developed and customized, but if we don't reach out to understanding the culture of schools and districts and how best to fit this, we will also, again, fall short. And what we're going to speak much about in the formative assessment here is that if we think about curriculum embedded assessment, these are assessments that are embedded in units of instruction that are not only one assessment, but multiple assessments build the skills and knowledge of students within those units of study. We believe, in part, that if we could use that embedded curriculum assessment as a catalyst for change, and then the three-legged stool that Tony talks about, the intersections between curriculum instruction and assessment, can be realized. So Barbara, I'm handing it off to you.
Okay.
All right. One of the things that happens in your number 4 panel 6 is you want to distinguish yourself from what happened before. But I'll start by saying I'm in wild agreement with what we've already heard, some really key issues. But I tried to think about this a little bit from the standpoint of a district or school. And I think the major challenges are twofold. One is really this calls for reframing teaching and learning around both deep understanding and transferable skills and practices. Not just being able to pass a test at the end of the unit, but actually being able to transfer what you've learned and use it in novel situations. That's at the core of the standards. That's a huge change. And so that kind of deeper learning, really changing the whole system, as you heard. And secondly, making the time for deeper learning. I think that's a huge challenge. We find in our work with districts that even when you work very closely with teachers and with the district around co-designing curriculum embedded assessments, formative assessments, and curriculum units, there's a lot of PD, you've got all the parts, it's coherent and hangs together. We still hear from the teachers, but I have this curriculum pacing chart. I know that this group of my students doesn't have this particular skill down or doesn't understand this concept in a way they'll be able to use it again, but I don't have time. And I think that's a really key challenge. Then going back to that first challenge, I think the understanding of what these standards mean is obviously a huge issue that formative assessment can really help us with. But to get that understanding on the part of everyone involved in the school system, and also to get that coherence, you really have to carefully unpack these standards in terms of the knowledge components, the skill and practice components that are involved in them. And what we've been doing in our assessment group at SRI is really use an evidence-centered design methodology to do that in a very systematic way. And then when you do that, and you really understand the knowledge, skills, and abilities required for the standards, you can use those both in designing the formative assessment and in looking at your curriculum and looking at your PD, making sure they're all consistent. But without that underlying discipline, which would not be possible, by the way, without technology to help you track all of this. We've tried, and you can't. You cannot get that coherence at a deep level. You're going to always be at a surface level. So I think that's a really major challenge. And then one thing that's a little different from the work we've been doing and the work that Scale has been doing, one way to get the coherence is the curriculum embedded formative assessments that were designed along with the curriculum. And that's a good way to do it. An alternative that we've been focusing on is trying to have rich assessment scenarios that connect with the same knowledge and skills, but are not embedded in the curriculum, so that you can use them with multiple curricula, because we probably don't have the resources nationally to really do this kind of good formative assessment development for every curriculum that's going to be used across the United States. So it's a little bit different approach that I think as you go to the breakout sessions, you'll see two alternative ways to address the issue.
Boy, I'm lucky to have such smart colleagues. So I'll start with ESN. Everything that was said I agree with firmly, and then say a few words about priorities. The people who wrote the math standards said the key words to remember are focus and coherence. Okay. You've got to have a small number of things that you care about that count, and you've got to really focus on them in order to make progress. So that's point one. Point two, I want to in the people who are working with students. So let me mention a couple of them very briefly, first at the classroom level, and then make the obvious analogies. The first, content has to come first. And as you look at the Common Core standards, as you look at the next generation standards, we're asking for richer, deeper conceptual understanding, and we're asking for much more interactive classrooms. The old model of lecture as spray and pray has pretty much been abandoned. The other definition of lecture is the process of notes passing from the pages of the teacher to the pages of the student without passing through the minds of either. We know that real learning comes from significant active engagement on the part of students. That makes the whole classroom dynamic much more complex. So as we think about the things that we want to have happen, here are a couple at the top level that we want to focus on in classrooms. First, as I said, the content, getting a rich, deep sense of what it is that needs to be learned. Second, meeting the students where they are in productive ways. Guess what? That's what formative assessment is about. It's finding out what people know, building on it, building with it, and providing the students opportunities for sense-making and productive struggle. You can't spoon-feed them, and you can't toss things at them that are way beyond their reach. The third thing, so that's two within that, so there's content, formative assessment, productive struggle. And then, what do kids get out of all of this? What's really important is their sense of themselves as disciplinary thinkers. As a math person, I encounter all sorts of people. When I say I'm a math person, they say I gave up on math in middle school. I'm not a math person. Well, that's crazy. Okay. People build their identities by interacting with the discipline in our classrooms. And the question is, how do we build a sense of agency, a sense of authority, a sense of productive identity as a person, as an individual? For everybody, that's the equity dimension. We're not talking about just a small band, we're talking about reaching all the kids in powerful ways. Those are 5 things that are absolutely essential, and popping up a level, I want to point out, they're absolutely essential for professional development and for the learning institutions we live in. We want to focus on the things that count. That's the disciplinary stuff. We want teachers to be empowered to do what's right, and I mean all teachers, and we want our professional development to meet them where they are, and as a community, has been mentioned, build on their strengths cumulatively so they know where they're going and help each other get better.
Well, as the last in the line here, I can say all of the above. Yes, indeed. And also, I want to underscore what some of our work at West Ed has been trying to focus on and emphasize. First of all, in the standards, in both Common Core and Next Generation, we're looking at deep learning. Well, what does that really mean? So when we start looking at how we want students to be able to integrate the kinds of important ideas and concepts and take and apply those in important and meaningful problems, that's different in many ways from some of the more surface level kinds of coverages that many schools have in the resources made available to the teachers. So what we try to do in our work, because we're focusing in some of our programs on the affordances of technology to support deeper learning, is expanding the notion of learning environments. So we're thinking of not static texts or different forms of media, but how we can integrate these different forms of ways that students engage in encountering the disciplinary knowledges, integrating them and applying them and transferring them across various kinds of problem types in the field. The standards are the spine of the work that you want to use to select, since you can't cover it all. And we think that's very important in considering what an expanded notion of a learning environment is, beyond the textbook, beyond the static forms of information access that has been the common resource for too long. So we're very key on integration, on active kinds of uses of that information in important kinds of tasks, and then being aware that collaboration among students for sense making and among teachers and schools for not just working together, but coordinating some resources so that there are many options on the menu for teachers to use in classrooms to both monitor the progress of learning, to see how it coordinates within subjects across grades and also among different subjects at the same grade. So project-based learning, thematic kinds of activities within schools are now becoming ways that broader learning environments can be designed and applied. And I think a very key interest and need in the area of formative assessment is the kind of evidence that we gather, that we plan on that evidence in advance and how it links to the standards and knowledge and processes we're trying to promote, and that we systematically gather and act on that evidence with alternative kinds of adjusting instruction that have been developed over time, and different teachers have worked together to promote, and different resources can provide, so that the menu is available for the teachers to use in alternative ways, given the progress monitoring that's going on during the instruction. So evidence of achievement of standards and progress on them, I think, are things that we want to keep our eye on very, very carefully as we start thinking about what's significant, what's transferable, what do we want our students to come away with at the end of the day.
Okay. Is this helpful? Okay. So, as I noted at the beginning, I do a lot of work in Sacramento, and among policy makers, there's, I think, a misperception that formative assessment is a set of tools. And, I've actually heard people say, well, yeah, we're going to buy that and Smarter Maps and, checkbox, we're done. On the other hand, there are those who talk about formative assessment, sort of, I think of them as formative assessment militants, who aren't interested in the tools, they're just interested in the practice. And I'm not going to go down the row again, I'll let you all fight for the mic. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship between tools and practices. Clearly, tools are important, but when we talk about changing the culture of schools, we're talking about practice and not simply about something that you can get off the shelf. So would someone like to start?
I have one. I think this group definitely would come out on the side of formative assessment as practices, unless the information used from the assessment is used to guide further learning, whether by the student, him or herself, or by the teacher, in terms of working either with individuals or with groups or the whole class. It's not really a formative assessment. It's just asking some questions or getting some information. So I think that's a really important distinction, and that's part of why this gets so wrapped up in you can't just buy something off the shelf, as David was referring to. You really have to change the way of thinking about what teaching and learning is, and the way of practice, and the expectation around things like curriculum pacing guides, and what counts as being really important learning for a particular class and a demonstration of that learning.
So I was lucky. Somebody always says to me, "You mean you're really not an announcer?" so I don't need a microphone. And I'll take advantage of that just for a minute to say that people always ask, what's formative assessment? And it's actually everything teachers do to understand their students' reasoning. And this is a habit of mind that teachers have to grow into, and the whole profession has to grow into it. We're so accustomed to the kind of assessments that have been in the forefront from No Child Left Behind, all of these things that are developed by outside vendors, dropped into the curriculum, and then used for high-stakes decisions. So the one point I want to make about formative assessments, it's what we do in the classroom as a part of instruction to understand the content that our students are learning and the practices that they're learning, their reasoning. And so there are times we can formalize that. You can take a task in a curriculum and use that as a formal gauge of all of your students' learning and then make decisions going forward about that. I think it also involves, and the second point I want to make, anticipating how students will do on the work that we're asking them to do in classrooms. We know from many years on the floor with students what's likely to happen when they engage in particular tasks in curricula. And so we have to have different roads for them to take, given that different things might happen. That's a part of formative assessment as well.
So I began once again with Me Too. Let me talk a little about the change in our understanding of what it means to understand discipline over the past 25 years. It used to be we crammed students' heads full of facts. You know, in math it was the quadratic formula. In history, everybody resonates to the date of 1066. A large part of what we taught was stuff that was packaged in small bits and reproducible. And what we discovered or we elaborated over the past 25 years is that equally important are what Tony called practices, what are also known as habits of mind. It's thinking like a historian, thinking like a writer, being a writer, thinking mathematically, having mathematical or scientific habits of mind that when you're confronted with a problem, you go, how do I make sense of this? So you can think of the content as a set of tools that are used in the service of solving problems, engaging with the discipline. Now, just as I said, everything that happens at the classroom level for students happens at the PD level for teachers. Formative assessment is a habit of mind. There are various tools that you can have, and you will see lots of them over the course of a day. But the point is that the teacher who's made it a habit of mind, a form of pedagogical sense-making, walks into the classroom saying, we're going to cover, we're going to deal with this content. I have a sense of what my kids might think about this. I have a sense of where they might go right, might go wrong. But I need to listen to them very carefully. I need to set things up so that I will hear what they have to say. And then I need to be prepared to deal with it. Because let me tell you, the first time you open things up and your students actually tell you what they're thinking, blows you away. There's as much of a learning curve in learning to take the tools of formative assessment and use them powerfully by listening to your students and adapting in the moment, but with things you've learned are useful for your students. That's as much of a change as it is for the student who's used to being told, here's the formula, go do it, or here's how you write a 3-paragraph essay, and is now told, think about communicating with your audience, okay? So all these formative assessment tools are just that, in the service of a form of pedagogical sense-making. Real formative assessment, as Tony said, is a critical component of good teaching, which means listening and reacting to what your kids do in ways that can help move them forward.
So, can we let Eva? Ray, can you let Eva?
Of course, I'll always bow to my elders.
classroom practice, you know, the behaviors of you and your students as you go through life. And the other is as the standards define practices, which tends to focus on the cognition or the thinking skills that get embedded in the content. So the kind of practice I'm talking about is what goes on in classrooms, number one. Number two, the question about technology or tools. I know it's a culture change, and I know it's a habits of mind change, and I buy into all of that. But there is a pathway to get there, and it isn't something, you know, where the light shines on you and all of a sudden you're able to do it. What I'm hoping that you will explore are tools that will make it easier for you to do this kind of transformation of the way you think, assuming that you're not doing this already, which may be a false assumption. But there are tools that may help. For instance, a teacher who may not have a full repertoire of lots of different ways of going about teaching a particular topic or concept. They find their kids having difficulties along the way, as Alan said, anticipating what kids may or may not be able to do. Years ago, I will say it was years ago, I did do a study where I asked teachers what would they do if some proportion, 50% of the students in their class couldn't do the tasks that they had in mind. And the answer was, by over half of the teachers, that they would do the same thing again. Okay? They would reteach in that term. My suggestion to you is that that may be an okay strategy, but it's probably more important for you to find some diverse entry points that will click with different kids. And to do that, you may actually need resources that could be seen as technology tools or other supports for you in the classroom or in the collaboration that you develop. So I think they go together. It's just that I think what the group is saying is that you don't rely on the tools by themselves as if they are going to fix things for you. It takes the practice and a way of using the tools to improve your, you know, abilities to connect with students and to help together to learn what the standards are about.
In fairness, I think we should give the last word to the youngster on the panel.
Thank you. I was short-stopping this because I knew that Eva would be stealing some of my thunder, because I was about to say something very similar. So I'm going to be very, and much of what I've learned about performance assessment is with the wonderful work that CRESST has done over the years. But I had a little deja vu here. You know, there was a big movement around performance assessment in the early to mid-90s. There was CLASS here in California, which was so forward-looking, so beyond what assessment was developing at that time, that we sort of forget sometimes the lessons learned in that process. What I'm trying to think about at scale and among these centers is some synergy between sort of home cooking, people sitting together, collaborating, designing their own assessments. This happened much in the 90s. And there wasn't, it was hard to know what was alike and what was different from one system to the other. They used different score scales, they used different rubrics. At that time, there wasn't many tools or science built into the work. So I wanted to speak to smarter tools, which is sort of the theme I think that we would bring to this table, is that, you know, tools, smart tools currently are adaptable tools. These are tools that really are sensitive to your curriculum instruction, but it's a place to start. You know, teachers know their classrooms, they know their curriculum best, and there's ways of thinking about the design of school of tools to sort of reach this level of coherence that Tony talks about, but in a way that is smart and adaptable. So I think the next generation of assessment, what's new and different, is much of the way Alan talks about it, the expansion of formative assessment in part to a habit of mind. The development of tools that are not one size fits all but adaptable in ways in which they're designed. And then capitalizing on not only collaboration but networks, sharing among themselves to deepen our knowledge and understanding.
Okay, I'd like to thank our panel.